Okay, this is the second part of lecture 2, where I'll be discussing the paper I signed by Janet Hyde. And the theme of this section is the cost of emphasizing gender differences. So Janet Hyde rightly notes that researchers and lay people alike focus way too much on gender differences, ignoring the wealth of similarities between men and women. This fixation or even obsession on difference does a disservice to our science and humanity. Hyde analyzed 46 meta-analyses to test the hypothesis that gender differences are vastly outweighed by gender similarities. So, what's a meta-analysis? Meta-analyses test whether a particular finding holds up or generalizes over a large number of people, samples, as well as methodology, differences in questionnaires, differences in behavioral outcomes, and actually differences across the researchers who are conducting the research. So you take results from a number of studies and you boil them down to an effect size. It's called Cohen's D. And what that Cohen's D does is it lets us see at a single glance if the sex difference is small, moderate, or large. D's of 0.20 are small. Anything less than 0.2 is considered trivial, i.e. not a difference. But a small difference is indicated by a Cohen's D of 0.2, moderate is 0.5, large is 0.8 or higher. Meta-analyses that are done by different analysts, like Janet Hyde is not alone in terms of people who have conducted meta-analyses, but they also might return different results because of vagaries in how they decide to collect the papers they're interested in studying, or differences in software they use when they crunch the numbers, right? So the optimal way to go about finding out if a sex difference is small, moderate, large, or not existent is to synthesize across many, many, many meta-analyses, right? Whenever that's possible, that's the best thing you can do. And the thing about gender is that there's so many studies of gender differences that have created a number of meta-analyses of gender differences for, say, a particular ability, like doing math or spelling, or different traits like being tender-minded or aggressive, right? There's so many of those that Hyde was able to synthesizing them. And so I'm going to refer to that as kind of a mega test of whether women and men differ on a variety of abilities and traits. So what did she find? She found very strong support for her gender similarities hypothesis. Specifically, she found only 4 gender differences that could be considered large, that is, that had an effect size of 0.8 or greater. One of these is physical aggression. Another is frequency of masturbation and interest in sex. A third was tender-mindedness, or feeling empathic towards others, being sensitive towards other people's feelings, for example. And throwing velocity, the ability to throw a ball quickly as well as far distance, right? And then there's even some caveats to those very large gender differences, such that physical aggression depended heavily on social factors. For example, when women weren't being watched while playing a violent video game, they were just as aggressive as men were. If they had a monitor, somebody watching them, then they dial back on the violence, right? And there was only a large gender difference in one of the meta-analyses that Hyde synthesized, and that was a meta-analysis by Archer. The others did not show a large gender difference, even on something as stereotypical as men are more aggressive than women. Self-reports of masturbation and interest in sex. I highlighted self-reports because, as I just mentioned in part 1, we have to be skeptical whenever people are asked about something like sex because of the sexual double standard. Men are far more encouraged to be sexually expressive, and women are actively discouraged. And self-reports of tender-mindedness, it's not considered manly or masculine to be an empathetic or tender-minded person. So again, in this case, the double standard is reversed, so women feel freer to report that they care about other people, whereas men may feel constrained in their self-reports. And finally, throwing velocity and distance. Absolutely, men on average have more muscle than women do, and they practice throwing a ball typically more often than women do, starting from children on. But when women work out, they're just as strong as men. In fact, they look a lot like men. So I ask you, nature or nurture? This gal up in the upper corner here is a sports psychologist, and I met her at a conference once, and I asked her if she got in trouble, some kind of backlash for being a woman in a very male-dominated field, i.e. sports psychology. And she said, not so much. She said what she really got backlash for was being pumped, right? She's got this incredible body, and people look askance at her, ask her personal questions about, whether she's on steroids or not, or what her problem is, that she feels like she has to bulk up like a man does. And they frequently ask her if she's a lesbian, which she's not, right? So, and I also find that when I teach this course in the classroom, that it generally leads to a discussion of how uncomfortable some of these women make even myself feel. I wonder really what's going on with that. But I have much the same reaction when I look at male bodies that have been distended and distorted beyond what I would call aesthetically pleasing. So one thing to notice is that it's a prescriptive stereotype that women be weaker than men, and certainly not to look like this. But all in all, men and women are more alike than different. The overall Cohen's D that Hyde found through her MEGA project, her MEGA test was small. Her D was 0.21, so that's a very small effect, and that's crunching over all of the meta-analyses that she found. So why is it so small? Well, it's because the differences between individuals are a lot bigger than the differences between men as a group and women as a group. In other words, people differ. That's obvious. You've known that all your life. But knowing someone's gender doesn't help to explain why. It's not a good predictor of human variation. And that's because the overlap between men and women looks a lot more like this top diagram than the one a lot of us are running around with this picture in our head, right? That's just not the reality. So even when we do find sex differences, they tend to be very small. And I'll just remind you that with frequency distributions, you almost always find that bell curve, that normal distribution. And that means that some people, in this case, are not doing so well. Some people are doing incredibly well, but most of us are in the average or the so-called middle, right? We form the bell of the bell curve. But the variation between that happens within men and happens within women is huge. But the difference between them as male and female is very, very small. Okay, so this is a false picture of gender. And doesn't that make sense when you think about it? After all, we come from the same species, Homo sapiens, and we live on the same planet, Earth, and we share all but one chromosome. Women have the double X, and men have one X and one Y. But still, we have this idea of difference. It's an obsession. It captures our imagination to the point where John Gray has written a popular series of books. The first one was called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And here's a list of other books by John Gray, all of them bestsellers. You can pause if you like and take a look at them, but you can see he's just definitely married to this idea that men and women are so different, they might as well come from different planets. So two researchers, Carruthers and Rees, they were really troubled by the popularity of these books and wondered, when so many people are so invested in an idea, maybe there's a kernel of truth to it. So what they did, they decided to do a deep dive into 13 studies where the researchers had found a significant sex difference, and the studies covered a wide range of topics, all of them commonly stereotyped by gender, that is commonly believed to be something that differs between men and women. So some of the tests for gender differences included sexual attitudes and behavior, desired mate characteristics, intimacy, empathy, social support, caregiving and relationships, and interest in learning science and ease of learning science. So, ready for the results? On every dimension, Carruthers and Rees found that men and women are more similar than different, echoing Hyde and echoing Zenter and Matura, right? They say, this is their conclusion, the Mars-Venus view describes a world that does not exist, at least here on Earth. Our work shows that sex does not define qualitatively distinct categories of psychological characteristics. We need to look at individuals as individuals. Amen. So the takeaway is that biological sex differences have very little to do with human variation, contrary to evolutionary psychology's claims. Whenever we do find gender differences, we have to keep in mind that we're actually studying status differences, right? There's no such thing as a clean test of gender differences that isn't also confounded with the power gap, with men having more power than women. And that makes status or power a more likely explanation of the differences that we find. For example, check out this group of photos from my very first undergrad social psych of gender course. And it is not unique. It echoes every other roster I've ever downloaded. So just pause your movie and kind of take a look at the faces and then come up with a conclusion of who smiles more, men or women. Not every woman is smiling, and there are a couple of men who have kind of smiles, but for the most part, men have neutral faces when they're not actually scowling at you, and for the most part, women have a smile on their face. It might not necessarily be a broad smile, but for the most part, they're smiling, often with their teeth. So women smile more, but as Hyde found, that was only if women are being watched, as of course you're being watched when you have your photo taken. Otherwise, Hyde found no sex difference in smiling. So what's going on here? Ask your female friends, your female relatives, if they've ever been told by male strangers to smile. Just a command out of the blue. Smile, or smile, you'd look prettier if you smile. What's wrong? Smile. 100% will tell you, yes, I've had that experience. And if you ask the same question of male friends, they'll say, no, not a single one. So that's a huge gender difference, right? And it has nothing to do with biology. Men don't have somehow inferior smile muscles, right? It has all to do with status. Men are simply left alone. Strangers don't bug them. They don't tell them how they should look, what expression they should slap on their face. But women have to ingratiate themselves, even if the smiles are fake, and even to men who are strangers. Okay, so let's look at some genuine sex differences to see whether the status difference is warranted. Women have more body fat, men have more muscle. Women are shorter, men are taller. Women have a better sense of smell, men have a weaker color vision. Women are sexually rearoused quicker, men enter puberty later. Women report about 5 times more depression than men, but men are more likely to actually do the deed. Women have lower infant mortality rates, right? If you're a premature baby, you're lucky if you are a female one. There's something about that double X that's protective, both at the beginning and the end of life, because men actually die on average 5 years earlier than women do. And part of that has to do with women kind of having a backup immune response. We're even finding that with COVID. They're kind of drilling down to figure out why men are dying at higher rates than women are of COVID-19. And the best guess they have so far is that women have a stronger immune response to the coronavirus, and that's because they have a double X chromosome, or so the thinking goes. And women are less likely to be alcoholic, whereas men are more likely to be able to wiggle their ears. So there's just take a look. There's not much here biologically to support men having greater status, having more power than women, yet around the world they do. Men have more structural power. They are more likely to be leaders in organizations of all kinds, from government to corporations, and resources, financial as well as social networking resources compared to women, even in relatively gender egalitarian nations. So we don't have a country, much less a whole planet, where men and women are equal. We don't have the ability to really test for gender differences that aren't confounded with status differences. And if biological sex differences can't explain why men have the upper hand when it comes to status and power, then we have to really look at cultural factors, right? The attitudes and beliefs that people are taught and conditioned to believe about the relative worth of women and men, which is, in a nutshell, kind of the topic of this course. How did we get into the situation where men have more power than women? And if it's not justified because of something as innate as biology, then where does it come from? So then how should we think about genes? Like, what evolutionary psychology suggests is that there's something immutable about genetic adaptation that leads to sex differences in behavior. But as I've been telling you today, that just simply isn't true. So kind of what good are genes? And I think the best explanation is what genetic adaptation allows people to do is to be incredibly flexible. That's the strongest impact that genes have on our behavior, is that they're so flexible, we are able to adapt to different norms and customs. Whatever situation we find ourselves in, whatever country we're born into, whatever country we might immigrate to, whatever social milieu is like within institutions that we might travel to, we can adapt because our genes allow us to be flexible. So people can decide if, when, and where women will have equality with men. That is a human decision that our genes would allow us to make. There's nothing preventing us from deciding women and men are equal. And also, our genes allow us to come up with different explanations for gender differences in the status hierarchy. Is it down to evolution, or do social forces have more to do with things? And if it's evolution, we're stuck, right? There's really little a society can do, just like James Damore was arguing there's nothing Google can do to make his workplace more gender fair. So it's kind of a depressing argument to make. But in fact, this country, my country, the US of A, has changed so much just in my lifetime that I don't buy evolutionary psychology's stubbornness, right? Their claims that we're stuck. So evolutionary psych can't explain any of these dynamic shifts. There were enormous sexual revolutions in the 1920s as well as the 1960s and 70s. Sexual revolutions are what I mean is that there was a time when men and women weren't allowed to have sex prior to being married, but then those restrictions were relaxed. They were relaxed during the 1920s, during the so-called flapper era. We called it the Roaring '20s for a reason. And then they were relaxed during the 1960s when people were protesting the Vietnam War and experimenting with drugs and encouraging their peers to make love, not war. What about women's entry into the workforce during World War II? All the guys went off to fight the Nazis, and the women took over the factories and made the bombers and the tanks and the bullets and everything else. Women took over all those jobs and performed them incredibly well. Then the men came back and the women were sort of forced back into the home, but then came the second wave of the women's movement, and women moved en masse into the workforce again. So these are huge, huge changes that evolutionary psychology can't explain. And then with their focus on everybody wants to make babies, they have no explanation for the growing normativeness of people getting married or cohabitating and deciding by choice not to have kids. Child-free couples are proliferating, especially in Europe, but also in the United States. And as well, we see a decrease in marriage rates in Western nations that evolutionary psychology can't explain. Or the growing acceptance of LGBTQ people, not just the growing acceptance of people who come from sexual minority groups, but also just their very existence. They never talk about gays and lesbians or bisexual people or trans folk. They have nothing to say about it because according to them, evolution has stuck us into little boxes, labeled one male and one female, and then pre-programmed our behavior, our identity, what we want to be, what we look for in a mate, all these things. And so when people don't fall into their box, they just kind of close their eyes and they just ignore all this human variation. Moreover, genetic flexibility allows people to decide whether and when to have sex and with whom, whether or not to marry, and if so, should I marry one person or many people? Should I marry, if I am going with many, should I do that serially, one at a time? Serial monogamy, they call that, or, should I marry a bunch of people all at once? Or whether to identify as male, female, androgynous, or none of the above. Whether or not to eat meat is another choice that, our genes allow us to make. But so evolutionary psychology can't explain this enormous variation that we see in human behavior, both across cultures and within the same culture over time. One last note about evolutionary psychology. It used to be called sociobiology, and its chief purpose was to provide scientific, i.e. biological explanations for racial differences between whites and blacks. So there's a great deal of faux science, fake science, in which so-called sociobiologists, so-called scientists, were claiming that white people had bigger skulls than black people, to take one hideous example. So once sociobiology was exposed as a fake science conducted by racists, they changed their name to evolutionary psychology, and they ran away from race. They don't talk about race anymore. They talk about gender and gender differences. And that, having made that switch has allowed them to flourish in academia as well as popular culture. You can read newspaper articles about sex or marriage or anything, and you hardly ever find one that doesn't interview an evolutionary psychologist for their take on what's going on, right? But what I hope to encourage you to be, if nothing else, is to be highly skeptical of both their methods and their aims, which is to provide a biological explanation for why men have more power than women. Okay, that's the end of lecture 2, part 2. One more module to go. So again, jot down questions, send them to me by email, or put them in the chat when we meet on Wednesday, or raise your hand and we will have a class discussion about it.